Je pense sans cesse à toi.
Hello and welcome to The Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot-button topics in food and beverage. I'm your host, Catherine Cole. In episode 32, we've got 3 cider experts in the house, so we are going to discuss the most contentious issues in the world of fermented apples. In the studios of OPB today, I am joined by Erin James, author of Tasting Cider and editor-in-chief of Cidercraft, as well as Sip Northwest magazines. Welcome, Erin.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And Jeff Smith, author of Craft Cider, How to Turn Apples into Alcohol. Hi, Jeff.
Hello, thank you.
And the other Jeff Alworth, frequent panelist and author of Cider Made Simple, all about your new favorite drink. Hey, Jeff.
Hey there.
And now for our first topic, the new face of cider. The past few years have been good for cider and its fans, to put it mildly. The industry is growing at an astronomical rate, and even our legislators have taken note. At the end of 2015, in fact, Congress passed the Cider Act, which updated a Prohibition-era tax regime and gave cider makers across the country a new incentive to experiment. Erin James, you have the most recently published cider book in this room of the 3 of you, so maybe you can start us off. What's new about cider over the past couple of years, and how are cider makers distinguishing themselves from their forebears?
I think innovation. There's a lot of growth that's obviously happening nationwide as well as Canada, but innovation where people are getting creative, putting different adjuncts as far as ingredients from hops to spices to pumpkin puree in their ciders. And a lot of that comes from the lack of traditional cider fruit that our forefathers probably had more access to. What people have the largest access to is dessert fruit or culinary fruit. So they're fermenting that, which ends up being something fairly simple.
Okay, you got to back up for our listeners.
Sorry.
So what's the difference between dessert fruit, culinary fruit, and cider fruit?
So, I don't know if Jeff Smith wants to speak to this a little bit more, but there's the definite complexity differences. But dessert culinary fruit is what you'd find at the grocery store. Traditional cider fruit or cider apples are apples that are used specifically for cider. But I'll hand that over to you.
Well, the way we usually talk to people at the bar about it is the difference between grapes. So you can make wine from Concord grapes, but it's just kind of boring. It has no body and tannins to it. That's why you have Pinot Noir, Chardonnay grapes, which you don't necessarily eat. So with cider, it's kind of the same way. Dessert fruit, you can make cider from it. It'll turn into alcohol, but there's not a lot of complexity to it. Where cider fruit, which is usually not what you would typically pick out to eat, has a lot of tannins, acids, and complexity that'll make it a really interesting cider.
And those are typically like heirloom fruits, right? I feel like they're older varieties.
Older varieties, and there are varieties that are specifically grown for cider. So
They used to call them, they kind of do call them spitters because they're not edible. I mean, they're not poisonous. You can eat them just fine and survive. But they taste terrible because of that high tannin, that high acid. And they usually have a lot of sugar, but at that point, because the other thing's working against it, you don't necessarily want to eat that. So, but that, to what Jeff Smith's saying, it ferments into a much more complex product dry as the end result.
So, but Erin, you were saying that there's a shortage of cider apples, and I do know that cider is the fastest growing segment in the beverage industry, I believe. So.
Yeah, and a lot of data researchers say in American history, which is kind of cool.
Whoa!
Every state grows culinary fruit more or less. You can get it everywhere, and so that's that less complex fruit. So. Kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, is that one of the reasons cider is so different now and is so huge is because there's that innovation, ingenuity of how to use those apples that we have in excess until more and more people start planting cider fruit, which is a whole nother discussion. It's convincing old farmers to graft over to something that is very specific with super low yields. So,
it sounds like wine.
Yeah, it's a much more difficult argument, but it's not as much money yet, but hopefully it will be someday.
Huh. Well, Jeff Alworth, we haven't heard from you yet. So as a beer expert as well, can you tell me what the difference is between cider and beer, other than the obvious, the apple thing?
It's funny. Cider is often compared more to beer than wine, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest, where I think most people relate to beer. We have a relationship to beer. But it's a fruit wine, right? It's just made from a different ingredient. It's made from apples instead of grapes. Apples tend to have less bricks, so it's a little bit lower alcohol. And I think
Bricks being sugar.
Bricks being sugar, right? So it has less sugar, which means it ultimately has less alcohol. So when you look at the ABV, it is a little bit closer to beer than it is to wine. But in all other ways, it's a wine. And when you're looking for a quality cider, you're looking for the same thing you look for in a wine. You're looking for body structure, tannins, acidity, aromatics, all those things that come together to make something really spectacular. If all the words you use for wine, you can use for cider. Very few of the words that you use for beer would you use for cider.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good comparison.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'll confess that when I started writing about cider, I'd been writing about beer, and all the cider guys, I thought, fermented beverage, how hard can this be? And all the cider folks were pretty skeptical because this is what beer folks always do. They barge in and start talking about things they think they know. And so I got slapped around a little while and finally said, I don't know anything. I better start I should just assume I don't know anything and start from ground zero.
It's funny because as an editor, I look at so many beer writers writing about cider and wine writers writing about cider. I feel, and I mean, it's all subjective, but I feel as if the wine writers have a more accurate tone and voice to the tasting notes, because beer writers want to talk about the color and they want to talk about the texture, and which I definitely think texture is important, but color for beer is really big and not so much in wine and cider. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
Jeff Smith, you are a cider maker as well as a cider author. You own Bushwhacker Cider here in Portland. I'm curious what the Cider Act has done the Congress passed this Cider Act, but I don't really know anything about it. So how has that changed the way you make cider? Has it affected you at all?
It hasn't affected us because we're a pretty small producer, and most of the stuff we make stays in-house, but it's really lifted a lot of bans on the people who have bigger production rates, and it's relaxed them a lot. And more importantly, kind of abstractly, it's got people to think about cider as its own beverage and not just a tag along to a wine or a beer. So just the fact that the government's starting to look at it and take note of it and treat it with respect is kind of the biggest thing I think that came out of that, besides all the nuts and bolts of the actual rules and regulations of it.
And a lot of easing up on taxation, right?
Correct.
That's usually what this is all about.
Yes.
It's usually old laws going back to Prohibition with any fermented beverage in the U.S.
It's definitely not sexy.
No. It's the paperwork part is definitely not the glamorous part of making cider or wine or anything else.
Yeah.
So
how are you pushing the boundaries with your cider making? Or how do you surprise people when they come into your cider house?
Well, we try to be different. We try to make things with different yeast strains, different barrel techniques, because I think you can fit into the trap of getting this base juice from Hood River and adding adjuncts to it. And unfortunately, sad to say, it all starts tasting kind of the same.
Okay, so base juice from Hood River, you're talking about apples that would normally be eaten, not...
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and basically a lot of producers in the Northwest get the same base. And how they use it after that is how they put their spin on it. So at Bushwhacker, we try to make things that sometimes work out and sometimes don't. But the great thing about our business model is the instant feedback we get from customers. And they're very honest. They can be very harsh, but honestly harsh. So we get feedback, and then we can pass that on to other cider makers with something we've tried, and then maybe they can inspire them to do something. But, I like using barrels a lot and different fermentation techniques than just adjuncts, personally.
And what do you mean by adjuncts?
Let's say you want to make a pineapple cider. So you start with your base, then after fermentation, you basically just introduce pineapple juice to it. So the adjunct would be the pineapple juice.
I think it's any ingredient, like legally any ingredient that's not pear or
apple
or yeast
Yep.
would be an adjunct.
How crazy can you get?
It's a lot of. Have you met Reverend Nat? Located
this is
in
a
Northern
Portland
Yeah.
cidery.
Yeah, there's not really a lot of regulation on what you can and can't add. There are some issues when you add things, you can't call it a cider anymore. And you'll notice that on labels, it'll say apple cider with pineapple juice or something like that. There's pretty strict labeling requirements. But really, yeah, it's kind of up to your imagination and what the market will put up with.
I want an example. Crazy cider.
You can put habaneros. There's people who've experimented with habaneros. You can put other herbs and spices, fruits and vegetables.
Ginger's really popular.
Yep.
Oh,
Pineapple's
that actually
huge. In sheer numbers, pineapple is huge.
I think I don't know if it's the craziest, but we did a smoke cider about 5 years ago where we actually smoked the apples before we pressed them and fermented them.
Oh, that's cool.
So it came out kind of like a peaty Isla Scotch. That was crazy for us, but yeah, I mean, habanero, blackcurrant, everything.
A really common thing, going back to that question about beer, is to add hops at the end of the process, put in the conditioning tank when the fermentation is done or sometimes when it's about to be finished. And I think we'll see if that continues to be a fixture of cider, but it was one of those ways in which you created a familiar touchstone for people who already knew beer to find themselves when they were drinking cider. So I think a few years ago that was kind of a really big deal, and it seems like proportionally hopped ciders are no longer as dominant as they once were.
What also is really huge is mixed fermentations, keeping on the beer realm, and more of a sour style, in which the United States Association of Cider Makers has just recently released its guidelines, and sour was one of them, which kind of surprised me. But it's interesting because it shows just by the amount of people that are making that kind of beer-connected Sidra style Spanish.
What is it? What is a sour cider?
So they defined it, I think, just as a cider that's fermented to be really tart. And I think I'm sorry, I can't rattle off the top of my head what exactly it was how they defined it, but I would consider a sour style cider having usually wild fermentation, so that it's funky and farmhousey. Sometimes with barrels, sometimes with mixed fermentation, like in the beer world. So Brett, or I can never say it right, Lactobacillus.
Lactobacillus. Yep.
So close.
Wait, when you say mixed fermentation, what does that mean?
That would be those things. But Jeff Jeff A.
Multiple different kinds of yeast and bacteria used in the process. So Reverend Nat, who we mentioned earlier, does a beer that he uses. He only ferments with lactobacillus.
You mean a cider?
A cider. Sorry. Hazard of my trade. Which he uses this weird strain of lactobacillus. Typically, lactobacillus go through a lactic fermentation, so they don't produce a lot of or any alcohol. But he has some weird strain that does both lactic acid and alcohol, and it is very tart. So lactic acid is the thing that's in yogurt. It's kind of a sharp, clear, bell-like tart. And it's tart, it's sour.
Okay, so I'm concluding that all you cider people are turning just as geeky as wine people. So I'm
kind of
happy
have
to hear
to
this.
be. Yeah, you have to be, especially with something so niche and with something that you're committing so much of. I mean, I can't speak to this, but Jeff S. can. Committing so much of your life to putting into starting this thing that there's only 800 other producers in the country that are doing it. So you really have to commit money and time and energy into it. So it's a risk, but it's encouraging to see how many people believe in it. I mean, 3 of us sitting here have written a book about cider. That's so cool.
That's pretty great.
That's so cool.
Okay, one last piece of advice, folks. For people, we have listeners all over the country. So how can they identify a cider that's, a high quality cider made from heirloom apples, and how can they make sure to purchase that rather than the cider made from snacking apples? Is there any tricks?
The East Coast this is Jeff A. The East Coast is doing a fair amount of work. They're kind of, especially New England, but Virginia's catching up. They're doing different kind of approach, more like a wine approach, where they're doing a lot of acid fruit, which was a historical thing in the United States. Our old ciders were much more acidic than the English and French ciders that we have today. And so you find cideries in those regions that are really going for a real kind of wine character. They're typically not using other fruits, and they're using heirloom apples, and they're kind of interesting. So Farnham Hill is kind of a famous one. If you're on the East Coast, you can find that one.
I think kind of piggybacking off of that, you'll find them in larger formats. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more heritage, traditional, heirloom, whatever kind of title you want to use for it, you'll find it in 750s or
So
500.
like a wine bottle.
Yeah, or 500 milliliter bottles. But I don't. Usually that's the way the packaging goes. It doesn't have to. I always say just drink a lot. Just taste a lot of cider. Figure out what you like that way. It's the same way you would with wine and beer. You just keep trying things. So walk into Bushwhacker and get a flight.
Yeah, I was going to say, and support small cider makers like Jeff Smith.
Yeah. And I think, too, when people use heirloom or cider varieties, they're very proud of it because it is a labor of love. So the packaging will probably say that on there because they will use that as an advertising thing. And yeah, once you find one, especially from a small producer, support, because they don't have the budgets of the massive cideries or breweries who make cider.
Well, that's a great transition to a little tasting break for us. Jeff Smith, you brought in an artisanal cider. Can you tell us what you brought in and maybe we can taste it?
Yeah, I brought in something that I like a lot right now. And of course, I picked something that they only made 27 cases of. It's from Alpenfire, which is a cidery near and dear to my heart because I really love the people who make it. They have an orchard up outside of Port Townsend.
In Washington.
In Washington. And this one was a collaboration between them and Multnomah Whiskey Library. And they used a local distiller here in Portland, Bull Run Distilling, to age basically about 90% Kingston Black, which is a traditional bittersweet cider apple, for, I think they said 5 months in barrels. They only made 27 cases, and it's from 2015. So it just came out. We only got one case. The rest go to Multnomah Whiskey Library. But it's really pretty amazing. Just subtle, nice, and really what I'd like to see more people make.
And Multnomah Whiskey Library is a very kind of exclusive, what would you call it? Almost a private bar here in Portland, except you can get in. You just have to wait a long time.
That's what I hear. I've never been. But anything Alpenfire, I'm a geek for. So this one to me is a real cider geek kind of cider. We don't expect it to fly out of the shop, but this is something that they should be proud of, and I'm really proud to carry. So I will open it.
And
really
of course,
excited for this.
He has a bottle opener on his keychain.
Yeah, Catherine and any listeners who may not be cider geeks, what Jeff just said got probably Erin in my mouth really salivating. That sounds like it's going to be spectacular. This is the most famous apple in cider making, and it's barrel aged and all these wonderful things. So we hear that and get very excited.
Oh boy!
Well, in Alpenfire, everything they do, they grow themselves. Most things they do, they grow themselves on their estate orchard, which is beautiful and just so intimate. And it's cool to taste something that they put so much energy into, and also cool that people are dorking out about it all the way down in Portland because that's a substantial drive.
Well, it smells good.
What kind of barrels did you say it was aged on?
Bull Run bourbon.
That's right.
I love tasting and trying to smell things out of paper cups. It's a challenge.
It's what we had today.
Although
I can tell. I mean, it's a really beautiful beverage. I don't know anything about cider, but it's smooth. It has some sort of something sophisticated about it, I would say.
And it's amazing. That's what we try to teach people at the bar too. That's essentially one apple. I think there's a few more in there, but it's almost a single varietal with just a little bit of barrel, and you get that much flavor. If we all chose some words to describe it, we'd probably all pick different words. But that's just one apple. And that's why I get excited about more people planting cider apples and kind of, hopefully in the next couple of years, getting past all the kind of trendy ciders for the year, the pineapples, the coconuts or whatever, and then getting back to this when the orchards come on strong in about 5 or 7 years. And we'll start seeing a lot more, I think, high-quality stuff on the West Coast. Because like Jeff Alworth said, on the East Coast, you have the godfather of really American cider, Farnham Hill, and they've been doing the same thing forever. It's just high-quality cider, and we're starting to see more and more of that in Oregon and Washington.
Well, as long as we are tasting cider out of paper cups, I think we can move on to our second course, which is the purpose of professional taste testing. Is professional beverage testing an art or a science? Taste testers follow a rigid code of conduct, preparing their palates for accurate, thoughtful recommendations. But a wealth of research has recently emerged indicating that even the most esteemed professionals are inconsistent in their preferences, more receptive to contextual cues than their sensory receptors. Jeff Alworth, is there anything more than BS to the world of beverage tasting?
we have to run through a little history, but I think the quick answer is yes, and we'll come back around to that, why experts have some purpose in the world. But it is true that over the last decade or so, people have been doing, researchers have been looking at this expert opinion and judging how, using some data analysis to judge how well they actually do things. And the wine tasters have gotten the worst part of this. They have really been put under the gun, and they found in different, all different kinds of studies have been done, but researchers have found that if you do blind tasting and use the same bottle of wine in different flights, the same reviewers will give it different scores, which is not good. People, if you dye white wine red, people mistake it for red wine. If you tell people how much, if you pour wine, sorry, I keep calling everything beer. If you pour wine out of different bottles, it's the same wine, and one is expensive and one is cheap. People will like the more expensive bottle more, on and on and on. There are a lot of ways in which humans get fooled when they're trying to taste these things. So we have to acknowledge that. And I think it's for people who have placed in, and maybe an earlier generation placed a huge amount of trust in expert opinion, it's a nice reset to say, okay, we're all human beings. Let's understand what goes into what we call flavor, like all the inputs of millions and millions of different things that were contributing to our perception of a particular beverage. That said, I think that experts have three things that are worth, if they're good experts, that are worth paying attention to if you're a novice. And I look at wine writers for this because I'm at sea when I'm tasting wine. A good expert will know something about the history of the beverage, or maybe the region, something about the background and the context, which is really important. All of these different things, we're talking about beer, cider, or wine, have many different permutations. And you assume the expert knows all of those, so already knows where to orient herself. An expert should know something about the chemical composition of the drink. So we were talking earlier about cider. It's got acids and tannins and sweetness and all these different things, esters it might have. You expect an expert to know all those things and be able to pick them out. And the last thing is you expect an expert to have an aesthetic appreciation for the beverage. So when all that stuff goes together in the cider that we're drinking, for example, an expert should be able to say, this is a good cider, and this is why. This is why it harmonizes. These are why the flavors work together. This is why it works well in the context of its tradition, so on and so forth. So I think for those reasons, and experts, even with all that, will still get stuff wrong. These beverages are very complex, and they can be fooled. But it doesn't mean that they're ignorant about all that other stuff. And they do have some sense of the forest, even if they mistake the trees, I think.
Well, Erin James, you edit 2 beverage publications. So do you do blind tasting of beverages for those publications? Or?
We do. Actually, we just did our the issue comes out in mid-December, but Cidercraft's first cider awards, which was a lot of cider to be blind tasted. And then we First Sip Northwest, we do our Best of the Northwest, which came out in the beginning of October, where we blind taste wine, beer, spirits, and cider. All different judges for all of them, different panels, lots of judges. A blind tasting can be very powerful and can really show what people are looking for when they're tasting for that category. So many times for our best Cabernet Sauvignon, it's been a $12 bottle beating out $60 to $80 bottles of Cab. And so that's just it's so interesting because you usually find those to be the more consumer-friendly styles, so really fruit-forward, easy acid, tannin, but just enough for structure. So they stand out in a lineup because they're easy to drink and you enjoy it. Not that the $80 single vineyard Pinot Noirs aren't fantastic, but they kind of get lost in the wash a little bit. But what I think is super interesting, and I really agree with what Jeff was saying, and I think that's what's so tricky about all of those studies that I've done, because they're trying to fool you. They're trying to fool these experts, but they have these expectations set. So they're expecting the expensive wine to be the one that they like, or they're expecting this, and that can be as simple as expecting Cab to taste like Cab. And so, of course, they lean towards the one that is really amiable, really cab forward, as opposed to maybe a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more esoteric. Even if you were looking at them and tasting them and knew the context to them, you'd like better. So it's interesting. It's kind of mind games. But yeah, and that's across all 4 beverages that we cover. We've seen that. So it's interesting. It's a definite psychology.
Yeah. Jeff Smith, when I am tasting at professional tasting events, which I sometimes question what I'm doing there, but I notice that when I am lined up at a table, we usually are broken up into tables, tasting flights, and when I'm paired with a winemaker, usually those of us who write about wine have sort of our personal impressions or emotional impressions, and we might love a wine, and then the winemaker will say something like, well, this is totally flawed because there's TCA, or like they'll throw out some technical term for why this is wrong. And it's kind of, it's a downer as a consumer, but also I'm curious what it feels like for you to be on your side when you're tasting professionally. Do you get into that situation where you find a cider that's technically not well made, but people just like it, and does that frustrate you?
Yes. I agree with Jeff Alworth. There's a need for experts in the field. I think more so to give makers feedback. I don't know if the consumers really in cider yet care, but we just did a blind tasting at the bar for the consumers. And ultimately, that's what matters. Yeah. So there are a lot of ciders in the shop. I mean, I always joke, if I only cared the ciders in the shop I liked, we'd have a third of what we actually carry. So ultimately, it comes down to what the consumer wants to do. So I've had some ciders I love in the shop, and, we can't give them away. And we have some ciders in the shop I just wish people wouldn't buy, but, it keeps the doors open. So I think cider judging is important. It's really fun to do blind tastings with consumers. We did one last weekend. We had professional judges and we had consumers do the same blind tasting. And it was interesting to see the results were almost identical as far as like first through sixth place. So wow. So we try to know that it's ultimately up to the customer with their money to decide what is good. But yeah, I think professional judging is really important. More so for the makers.
I think it's huge to the consumer too. I mean, that's just good business for all of us. For us, for both of our magazines, we don't use scores, so we're just simply giving tasting notes for the winners. If we do it for our double gold winners, and the tasting notes explain what the cider tastes like, obviously from one writer's point of view, but it kind of helps as a guidebook or shopping list for readers and consumers to see, oh, I'm interested in that. That tastes like something I would enjoy.
Yeah, you mentioned scores, Erin, and Jeff, you were talking about some of those experiments. And I think that we read about when we were studying up for this episode, there was one experiment where they asked professional critics to score the same wine multiple times. Maybe you mentioned this. And they gave it different scores. So what does this 100-point scale mean? I mean, if today it's an 86 and tomorrow it's a 91, doesn't build consumer confidence to learn that. Do they score ciders and beers the same way with a numerical scale or no?
It depends for beer. Speaking for beer, it depends on the competition and how they set it up. There's a standard that uses a 50-point scale, but not every brewery or every competition uses that.
Have either of you guys been to Glintcap? No. The Great Lakes International Cider. It's in Michigan every year. That's kind of sets the standard for cider judging in the U.S. It's been around for just over 20 years now, and I believe they do a 50-point scale, but that's based off of what's the beer one?
BJCP.
BJCP. There we go. Yeah, so it's very not so loosely. It quite finely follows that, but it's been adapted for cider for judging. So that's been all that information's on their website, so you can look at how they do their scorecards, which I really appreciate that transparency. But I don't think that information gets back to the consumer in the end. So, just for internal scoring, I guess.
Well, if anyone wants to do any follow-up reading on this topic, I have to recommend someone who's been a panelist with us a couple times. Tova Danovich wrote a pretty funny article for the NPR website. It's called Okie with Notes of BS. Why wine tasting struggles to get it on the nose. So look that up on the NPR website if you're interested. Now, let's move on to our third course. We are moving into the holidays, so we thought we'd talk about beverage brands giving back. It's not something that's often discussed, but craft beverage producers are constantly being solicited for donations. And for micro businesses that are just making ends meet, it can be tough to be generous. This episode will actually go live the week of Thanksgiving, so let's talk about the expectation of charity from the beverage industry. Jeff Smith, as the owner of Bushwhacker Cider here in Portland, do you constantly receive emails from people requesting free cider?
Yeah, free cider or swag and stuff. It's year round, and it's hard because you have to say no. Because we, as a small company, we would be bankrupt. We would have been bankrupt the first year if we would have said yes to everybody. So we've learned some skills over the years on how to deal with that and not make people mad at us. But I think, when you ask somebody, you have to realize the size of the company and the reality of if they can do it or not. So one of the first things we did was we put up a page on our website that has what we are willing to donate to. And that usually kind of like filters some people out. And we try to be pretty neutral. I mean, for example, we have a soft spot for anything dog related. We try to stay away from like schools and stuff like that. But weekly, almost daily, we get hit up for donations. We try to kind of do what we can. Like right now we have a clothing drop off for a local charity, which doesn't financially really impact us.
Oh, that's a good idea. So people are bringing their donations in and you're just...
just the drop off point.
Yeah.
And I can only speak for Oregon, but the rules governing what you can and can't do are pretty clear. We can't donate product to anything that's not a non-for-profit. So we have to turn a lot of people down and try to explain to them it's out of our hands. The OLCC, the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, says what we can and can't do as far as giving away product. But all the time we get hit up a lot, and sometimes we end up being the bad guy, or we try to say, well, don't, we can't do it, but maybe try, Portland Cider here in town, or maybe Reverend Nat, maybe they have some money left in their budget for donations. We never just slam the phone down and say, tough luck.
No.
We try to help them out and talk to other people. And I keep in contact with a lot of other cider makers, and I ask them what they're willing to do. So if I hear of a charity that asks us, we try to push it on to somebody else so it gets connected. But it's tough because you don't want to say no.
Yeah. And it seems like every charity event, they always want some sort of alcoholic beverage. And it's
sure.
People, when they're planning these events, they think, oh, it would be so easy to just get some things in a bottle. It's not like having food donated where you have to have a chef come in and prepare it. Oh, it should be easy. Why don't they just donate it? But of course, it's not easy to be on the other side of that equation.
No, and it sounds mean, but every keg we try to donate, that's a lot of money lost for the business too.
Yeah.
And we just don't have the volume. And yeah, it's easy to just drop off a keg. But and what's really frustrating is when we have really good customers and regulars, and they're tied in with some kind of charity, and they expect, since they're a regular, to get something back, but because either the rules or financial reasons, we just can't always do it. We try, but we can't always do it.
Oh. Jeff Alworth, you are not a producer, but I'm curious, do you constantly hear from neighbors and friends who think you have a bunch of beverages lying around that you can donate to their events?
People don't think that personally of me, but I do get fairly regularly people say, so, I have this event and who gives kegs away? Like, how can we have somebody sponsor this? So that happens a lot, actually. There are a lot of events happening around all the time. And breweries in particular are generally pretty big volume companies. So, 10 kegs, if you're of a certain volume, may not actually cut into your bottom line too much. And many breweries make much more beer typically than a cidery will, or a winery. Many breweries do just have those programs. They typically don't get a lot of attention for it. I could start naming names of breweries that I know are very generous with kegs, and mostly people don't even know about it. So that's kind of a cool thing too.
Yeah, it seems like the producer should actually get something out of the equation, not to be crass about it. But I have heard winemakers complain that, if their wine is just the random glass that's being poured at the event, no one even really notices who the producer was. No one even looks at the label. So I'm working on an article right now for 750 Daily about this, and the winemakers I spoke with said they have their best luck when they are able to either pour the wine in person or donate something that's more like an experience. So rather than donating wine, donate a tour or a free tasting, and then that way customers come in and actually spend money.
Yeah.
Erin, have you come across this issue in your work?
Yeah, I get surprisingly hit up for by friends and family for Rotary auctions, for I'm throwing this event myself. Do you have any bottles laying around you could donate? Stuff like that. And I'm like, well, yes, but I have them because people send them for me to taste them and think about them, about writing about them. So that's kind of a disconnect, I think, from me personally. For a lot of friends and family, they're like, wait, but you just have all this booze laying around. I'm like, yeah, but booze has obligation. So I actually, I'm on a small board for the Northwest chapter of the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, and I have to go and I put myself in this position. It's wonderful. I'm so glad to be involved, but I have to go and ask contacts that I have to see if they'd be willing to donate. So I'm very careful about that, and I'm asking specific people that I know what we're doing is in their focus for charity donations. And that's one thing that I've noticed that a lot of people have, a lot of producers have, is they have their charity focus. They have their certain type of philanthropy that they dedicate donations to. So my husband works for a winery up in Washington, and they donate specifically to childhood illness, mostly Leukemia and Lymphoma Association. And then a brewery that I was chatting with, they do specifically to like civil liberties, social rights kind of movements, donations, events. So I think that's one thing that I've seen when looking around is that people kind of have their focus, and that's probably the best way to say no without having to say no too. So I reached out to one of the breweries for something, and they just said, "Oh, this is what we do. You're welcome to use our space, but we can't do a donation because this is our focus." So I think that's a really appropriate and I guess media-friendly way to say, no, we're not doing this. So
that's got to be so hard. I mean, Jeff Smith, you were saying sometimes you get a request every day. And I mean, these small businesses that people are running, the margins are so tight, right?
Yeah. Well, and the biggest frustration is you want to.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily you enjoy saying no. You want to help out. And there's a lot of good charities out there. But like Erin said, we've focused on because we're dog people, dog charities. And, you get into a thing, Cleveland High School might ask you for a donation. And you say yes. Well, then another high school asks you, and you say no. And then, you have a why. So, but, with the really good charities that we want to support, it is hard to say no. We don't want to say no. But, yeah, being so small, the margin's so tight that every keg just, helps us make payroll or pays the rent. So it's hard to give one away unless it's something we really want to be a part of.
So everyone, when you're about to ask your neighbor, the winemaker, the cider maker, or brewer for a donation this holiday season, just remember, it's not so easy for them. Time to move on to our dessert course, where we each share something foodie or drinky we've been enjoying this week. Thinking about ciders, I'm thinking back to being in Basque Country last spring, and I don't really know what I'm recommending here except just go to Basque Country and taste cider. It's pretty cool. It's like part of life. Every restaurant you go into, it's just on tap and really dry and drinkable. I do remember visiting one cider maker and winery up in Basque Country. It's called Bordato, and it's actually imported by De Maison Selection, so you might actually find their ciders here in the U.S. And I won't go through all the different ciders I tasted, but my overall impression was that it was so much like wine. I mean, I was really tasting the different variety of apple and, tasting a different cider from a different site. You could taste the terroir. So I'm just excited about cider and geeking out about it, and I want to find some more Basque cider. I don't know if I can find it in the U.S., but I'm going to look for it.
There's plenty, actually.
Oh, yeah?
You guys carry some, don't you?
Cider
There's a lot of it.
Oh, okay. I'll be in.
Yep.
I'll be in. Doing the blind tasting, not asking for a donation.
Thank you.
Unless it's for my dog.
Yep.
Erin, did you bring in a dessert item for us?
So I kind of have three. I have two super nerdy cider things. One, I'm really, really into still cider right now. I think that is probably, well, I can get even more specific. Still single varietal cider. We're not
still as in not
still
sparkling.
not carbonated. Yeah, no bubbles. And I think it's like one of the most naked ways that you can see cider, just completely, the apple completely without carbonation allows it to be, you're able to really taste and feel all of those natural sensations of the apple, which is super dorky. I also really am into red fleshed apples right now. I've been making apple chips out of Mountain Rose apples. I got them at an orchard in Hood River, and I've just been way too into that lately. I've taken a lot of pictures on my Instagram of pink apples with pink insides.
But you're not making cider out of them. These are
No.
apples for eating.
Mountain Rose, actually Alpenfire has a similar variety that they use, or might be like a cousin variety for their glow cider, I believe, and that's pink. And the resulting cider is pink. It all depends on the type of apple variety. So if it's something that has good fruit, good acid, that usually can ferment into something pretty drinkable. So that and chocolate milk. I really am into chocolate milk right now. I go through phases, just like from a creamery. It's so good. Plus, it's something I can drink as dessert. I'm secretly 8 years old.
But wait, you're saying creamery chocolate milk, so this is the gourmet version.
But yeah, it's fancy. But there's this great brand, and I can't remember the creamery. It's up in North Washington, and I get it at PCC markets. And it comes in these little reusable glass bottles, so you can return the glass bottle to the grocery store.
And do you ever do a blind tasting of
chocolate milk? God, I should. I have another friend who's really into it. There's this, I'm going off on a tangent here. There's this wonderful lodge up in the Snoqualmie Falls in Washington that has tableside hot chocolate service, and they bring out a cart, and they have this pot of just chunks of dark chocolate, and they pour steaming hot milk on top, and they kind of whittle it down and then pour it into your glass from like Spanish sidra style, like from the air down. It's truly magical.
Ooh, that sounds really good.
Plus the lodge is amazing. Just go there.
Jeff Smith, what did you bring us for dessert?
Well, being that it's harvest and we're starting to get apples and picking apples we actually picked last week, it's hard to guess how many apples fill a press. You always have either not enough or usually too many. So we always try to find new ways to use apples so we just don't waste them. So this year I've been really obsessed with pickling apples and making applesauce, which is really, really easy to do at home. But this year I started pickling them, and I'm really obsessed with them. So I brought some into the staff. They all love them. We can't sell them there, unfortunately, because of all the silly rules and regulations. But I'm really enjoying that because it is a struggle to always find something to use for those just a couple extra pounds of apples that won't quite fit into the press. So that's my new obsession is pickled apples. And since it's going to winter, my scotch comes back. So I'm gin 99% out of the year, but now I got my scotch fix on. So when I'm not drinking cider, I'm out drinking scotch.
And what's your favorite scotch?
Lafroig.
Oh, yeah. You're geeky.
Yeah.
Petey and geeky.
Yeah, well, the sad thing is it's an expensive hobby.
Yeah.
So gin's a lot cheaper. But pickled apples and scotch.
I have never heard of pickled apples before. Yeah. Is this what would you use this for?
I guess somebody with more culinary expertise probably figure out a better thing to do with it, but I just take it out of the jar and eat them. There's probably something else clever. The applesauce with pork and stuff like that. But what I really want to geek out this year is use some of our cider fruit we have to make pickled apples and applesauce. So we just picked one variety last week called Belle de Bois Coupe. It's a French variety. And I really want to make applesauce with Belle de Bois Coupe, and then maybe make a Kingston Black, and then a crab apple, then a red fleshed apple applesauce, and have like an applesauce tasting tray.
Wow!
And just be really nerdy one night. So that's the goal.
Sounds like a good one. Jeff Alworth, what did you bring us for dessert?
I'm going to mention a cool product that is, I think, available outside of Oregon. It's called a pommeau. Is the type of beverage? It's a kind of a rustic farmhouse concoction that farmers in Normandy figured out. They could take fresh sweet juice, apple juice that was not yet fermented, and pour young brandy in there up to a point where it would sanitize the juice and drink that. And it's called Pommeau there. And we have a producer here in Oregon called Easy Orchards that makes a bottle of, if he just calls it Palm, Kevin Zielinski, the guy who makes it. And in Normandy, my experience was it is a farmhouse beverage, so it's not taken super seriously. And they tend to be a little bit flabby and sweet and not very sophisticated. Kevin's is the best I ever had, kind of like by a long shot. And he just released this product not too long ago. He distills his own juice, which he makes into brandy, and then he uses that brandy in his own fresh pressed juice. And he calls it Palm, and it's amazing. It's kind of has a quality of a dessert wine, about 18%. But the apples that he has are European cider apples, so they're very tannic, and so it's got a lot of earthy, spicy characteristics in there. It's for as sweet as it is, it's quite dry. It's just spectacular. So look for that. It's wonderful. It's also a fun thing that most people don't know about, this Pommeau concoction. So that's fun.
That sounds delicious. And now I'm just obsessed with cider apples. I want to learn so much more about them. Thanks to you all for being here today. I really learned a lot from all of you. Jeff Alworth, Jeff Smith, and Erin James. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Today's episode was recorded in the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon. You can read all about us on the OPB website. Our producer is Alex Ward. Special thanks to OPB sound supervisor Stephen Cray. And our theme music was performed by the incomparable wine importer Kermit Lynch. If you like our James Beard Award-winning show, please help us out. Rate us on iTunes. Subscribe to The Four Top on your favorite podcast app. And please tell your friends about us. You can tweet us at @4top, all one word, or visit our Facebook page and post your thoughts about the show. We would love to hear from you. Bye.
Nuit blanche, nuit blanche, nuit